everyone, and welcome to the National Report, Episode 1. This is Richard Spencer, your host, and what an inaugural episode we have. Joining me today are Paul Gottfried and John Derbyshire, who is known, of course, as Derb to his friends and detractors. And before I bring them into the conversation, let me just give them introductions, although they probably don't need any introductions for our listeners. John Derbyshire is a contributor and columnist at vdare.com and Talkies Magazine, talkiemag.com, my old stomping grounds. And he is the author, most recently, of two books, We Are Doomed, a modestly titled book on modern life, as well as a recent collection of essays called From the Dissident Right. And you can find both of those, I assume, at Amazon, and you can find the latter, From the Dissident Right, at vdare.com. And he's also the author of a couple of books on mathematics, which I suggest you read. Also, I'd like to welcome Paul Gottfried. Paul is an emeritus professor of the humanities at Elizabethtown College. He is the author, most recently, of a book on Leo Strauss, called Leo Strauss and the American Conservative Movement. And he's also the author of a number of texts which are required reading, and these include Conservatism in America, Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt, After Liberalism, an autobiography, and I could go on. So it's a great pleasure to have both of you on today. So John, I'll begin with you. How are things over in Long Island?
I was just quietly wondering if since you mentioned that I'm commonly known as Derb, shouldn't Paul be commonly known as Gott?
Well, no, that means God in German. So I'm not sure we should be increasing Paul Gottfried's ego by
equating me with the deity.
Although I'm sure he would appreciate such a sentiment. But anyway, I'm glad you could fit us in, John, because I'm sure you were instructing Sunday school today on Sunday. So
yes. I was just browsing the blogs before we started, Richard, and one thing we might discuss, it doesn't have to be up front, but we might just discuss the seeking for some cheer in the Richwine affair. I just saw, for example, one of my favorite blogs, if you don't mind strong language, is Chateau Hartiste, which is a game blog. It's an offshoot of the what's called the manosphere.
By game, you're referring to poker, or?
No. How to pick up women. One of those books, but it's much more intelligent than that sounds.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And basically on our side, it's dissident right when it ventures into those areas. And he was discussing the Richwine affair and saying that there's a positive thing, there's a bit of cheer to be drawn from it, in that Richwine did not really apologize.
That's true.
And he was kind enough to mention me and point out that I also did not apologize. So at least we've got some people here who are just standing their ground. That's his argument. So he's finding some cheer in that.
I agree. Richwine didn't apologize. I think also these purges are a little bit different now in the sense that there's so much alternative media out there that, you know, there are all these different blogs, but as in toto, they outweigh National Review Online. So I think in some ways there's a kind of interesting dialectic, if you will, where you have most of the mainstream circling their wagons around it's good to purge him. I mean, there are obviously some exceptions to that, but more or less that's the case. But then you have this massive alternative sphere, the dissident right, the alternative right, and not just the right, who I think see it in a completely different way. And I think in some ways we're kind of outnumbering the gatekeepers. Maybe you could say that. So there is some little bits of hope in all this.
I think there's probably a lot of hope And, I feel embarrassed claiming there's hope, sort of given my usual stark pessimism about the world. But it seems to me, if you look at two recent purges, John's purge, the purge of John, and now the purge of Richwine, what distinguishes them from earlier purges is that there is a good deal of opposition to the purge, these purges, which is expressed in conservative circles. There were certainly people who came to John's defense, even within the conventional conservative movement, when he was purged. In the case of Richwine, his being purged was simply a mistake. It was a faux pas committed by a silly, stupid Southern Republican named DeMint, who was terrified of being accused of racism because he was a Southerner. And therefore, as soon as the Washington Post began to bitch, he kicked this guy out. For doing very for a dissertation that he had written years earlier, which was accepted by predominantly liberal committee at Harvard. Now, immediately, a whole bunch of conservatives, or sort of movement conservatives, Republicans, even in National Review, came to Richwine's defense. Now, when I got bounced out in the 1980s, hardly anybody came to my defense. No one came to Sobrand's defense. When other people, when the John Birch Society got kicked out in the 1960s, they were simply considered kooks. Although Buckley kicked them out for opposing the Vietnam War, they were subsequently denounced as anti-Semites and be kicked out because of their racism. Now, this kind of thing is unlikely to happen anymore. I don't think the purges are as unanimously accepted as they once were, and I think even within the present conservative movement, you get opposition to the purges, which is often expressed. And this was true in John's case. This is even more true in Richwine's case.
But I think that's true, and that dovetails with what I said in terms of the alternative sphere, the dissident right, being totally against this and outright making fun of the conservatives for being so PC. But don't you think there's the conservative movement, the mainstream movement, the DC conservatism is getting more and more PC? I mean, they seem to just be outdoing themselves. So there's maybe two countervailing movements.
Well, I think, but they're also looking to their right. They're noticing there's a disaligned right, an alternative right. There are even some libertarians who are sick of them, and therefore they have to play a balancing act, which was not the case 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, another thing is
when they were the gatekeepers. There was only National Review and a couple other things.
That's right.
Now there's
and there was Bill Buckley.
And I think. Oh, sorry, Paul.
Go ahead.
I think there's also a slow rising tide of fed-upness with the Orthodox right that even, I think, perhaps I'm trespassing into too much optimism here, but I think you could say it's even expressing itself in the political sphere with all the people who did not vote for the Republican presidential candidate last November. All the conservative people who did not vote for him. Look at the numbers. So I think there's a lot of people are homeless. A lot of people are politically homeless. And perhaps we can make ourselves their home. They feel disconnected from the GOP. And they have nobody to vote for. They have nobody to support. So I think that's another little ray of sunshine here.
Wow, this conversation is the exact opposite of what I expected. I expected to be passing out cyanide capsules by the end of the podcast, but now I'm just getting sunshine blown in my face by you two. It's crazy. Let me ask an interesting question. I'll direct this first to Derb, but Paul can pick up on it. What do you think about the future of HBD? And, I think we both recognize that over the past 5 years, the HBD sphere, and let me just, I'll say this. What I'm referring to is the idea of human biodiversity. I believe Steve Saylor coined that term. but it's certainly connected with another term like race realism. It's an idea that the study of human nature has great effect on society and culture, and that you should be looking for, say, evolutionary clues in order to think about culture and society. I would say maybe that's a good definition for HBD writ large. The HBD sphere is a totally alternative sphere, but it has been mushrooming over the past 5 years. I mean, it's amazing. There are more HBD blogs than I could possibly read now, and that was certainly not the case, say, 5 to 6 years ago. And it's kind of, at least in America, it's in a very interesting position where, we've had race denial and we've had human nature denial on the part of the left for years. Because in the left's imagination, you are a blank slate. You can be turned into anything that you want to be or the state wants you to be. And so there's a natural tendency that, say, the study of human nature would find a home on the right. But that's not really the case. I mean, if you look at the explicit statements from Heritage, it's kind of like, we believe that all men are created equal and you can be whomever you want to be, kind of stuff like that. So I guess the question, and I'll ask it to John first and then Paul, where do you, HBD, it is clearly a growing movement, and it's a movement that really attracts smart people. But where do you think this will find a home? Or do you think it won't find a home on the political sphere? What do you think about that question?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I myself think that we're heading for some kind of a crisis here. As you said a few minutes ago, PC and the denial of human nature seems to get more and more intense. Peter Grimlow has a nice phrase that I like. He refers to an interglacial. I once tallied up in one of my columns. I tallied up all my books, all my human nature books, books concerned with these issues of race and group differences and so on. I had about 50 books, and I just put them into categories by date of publication. And there was a big flurry of these books from the mid to the late 90s, and then it dropped off. So that was the interglacial, when it was okay to talk about these things, or at least much more okay than it was before and after. This was the period of, the bell curve and the Fernstroms, all these people writing these books about these things. So there was a little interglacial there, and it's now the glaciers have now advanced, and PC is more intense than ever. And yet, at the same time, on the other side of the chasm, we're accumulating more and more data all the time. I went through the references in Jason Richwine's Harvard dissertation. Three-quarters of the references in that dissertation were from later than 1990. Now, if you go to some of the left-wing blogs, or the comment threads especially, the people arguing against Richwine, to the degree that anybody is actually arguing, are citing things from, they're citing the Henry Goddard study, which was 1913. Or they're citing Cyril Burt, who ceased academic work in 1951. They're going way back. And I said in one of my columns, do these people drive Stanley steamers? That was a steam-powered automobile from the 1910s. So the chasm is widening from both sides. On the one hand, the human nature deniers are getting more intense in their efforts to shut down speech about this, and on the other hand, more and more data is accumulating about human nature. So there's got to be some kind of crisis, and the thing about a crisis is you never know what's going to happen afterwards. It's a kind of singularity. I speculated I gave a speech to CPAC last year, where I speculated that the left may actually go HBD. It's kind of their natural home. So that's one thing that might happen, and it's not an original speculation with me. I think Herrnstein put it forward back in the 1970s, but that's something that might happen.
Yeah, I've noticed that I can often talk to self-described liberals about things like HBD, and even, I would say, a kind of light version of eugenics, in the sense of it's a bad thing that more intelligent people aren't having children. And you can talk and kind of get a breakthrough with a lot of liberals. And where I think sometimes conservatives, particularly religious conservatives, there's almost a brick wall forms immediately once you even dip your toe into this subject. So, but that would be interesting. I don't know if that will happen. Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Derbysh said. There needs to be a kind of growing contradiction between scientific evidence and what people are expected to believe, particularly in the academic community, in order to show that they hold sensitive political views. I think at some point this conflict is going to, or this contradiction is going to lead to an explosion. And it'll be very hard at that point simply to tell, to create newer and more grotesque forms of Lysenkoism in order to deny what seem to be genetic differences among individuals and groups. But beyond that, I would say, is that there's something absolutely ludicrous about something which calls itself the right or the conservative movement, which accepts the sort of universal egalitarianism.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm writing this piece. I was asked to write a piece by Modern Age of what is right and what is left. And the first thing that comes to mind about the right is not egalitarian. The left is egalitarian. So it is absolutely unbelievable that the right speaks about, the interchangeability of all human beings, an ideology, pushes an ideology of human rights, global democracy, positions that I would identify with the left and even with the far left. It's strange to me that this book by Sowell is being celebrated in all these conservative publications, and what it does is restate the views of Jared Diamond, expressing geography, and then sort of mixing it up with some nonsense about blacks are on average younger than Jews or something. That's why they don't do as well. But of course, you can ask, you just totally invert that and say, why is it, that certain groups control their sexual desires, get ahead, others do not, and one could argue that this is rooted in biological difference.
Yeah.
But of course, Sowell never does that. Well, I mean, the point is, the point it would seem to me is that the contradiction is both ideological and scientific. There's a certain point at which you cannot push what are quintessentially radical leftist ideas as true conservative values. And there's always a right. Something like 29% of Americans, according to Fox News, believe that the present system can only be changed by violence or some kind of counter-revolutionary action. Now, I assume, though, that 29% does not consist of human rights ideologues or people who want to spread democracy all over the world. I assume many of them do believe, in essential human differences. Another thing that seems to be a problem is trying to speak of a right which does not believe in particularity, it believes in universalism, and one that believes in universal equality, because those are the defining positions historically of the left. Now, I'm not sure that the left necessarily holds different positions. I think these are largely overlapping positions. But to the extent that we have a right, I can't see how those who represent the right, the real right, would be in any way embarrassed by human differences, including socio-biologically rooted differences.
But there just doesn't seem to be a real right in the United States. I mean,
Well, no, it's not a visible right in the sense that it's a big political party.
Yeah.
But there certainly are lots of people on the right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But we're not organized, and we're not, in the Beltway having some kind of effect on the two-party political system.
But the other thing I would add is that what happened to Richwine was a fluke. If there had been somebody else in charge of Heritage Foundation, other than this gutless Southerner kissing up to liberals, he probably would not have been kicked out of his job. You look at all the people who weighed in on his side afterwards. Michelle Malkin. who, by the way, attacked Haley Barbour, another gutless Southern Republican.
Yeah.
National Review weighed in on the side of Richwine. There were very few people within the conservative movement who attacked him after this happened. Not Herenstein, unfortunately he's dead. The other
Charles
one,
Murray.
Charles Murray weighed in on his side.
Yeah.
So what was done to him was not widely approved even within conservative movement circles.
Yeah, just 2 points there, Paul. I would rather take issue with your idea that the political left is fundamentally and essentially associated with these doctrines of innate equality. One of the big talking points on the orthodox right, Jonah Goldberg made a book out of it, is that if you look back at the ideological antecedents of modern liberals, you get the late 19th century, early 20th century progressives. And they were associated with, things like eugenics and belief in fundamental and essential inequalities. That could be corrected by social action. So it's not quite that cut and dried. And in fact, I think we on the what I call the dissident right might look back at the progressives and some of the things that they were putting forward and saying, yeah, they kind of got it right, didn't they?
Yes, but the problem, I think, is that the progressives do foreshadow the dissident right more than they foreshadow the current left. This is something that I go into in several of my books. The discontinuity between the progressives and the current left. There's more continuity between or more of a connection between fascism and the progressives than between the progressives and the current left. The current left really is passionately egalitarian and universalist. Progressives were not.
Yeah.
They just believed in a strong state to carry out what they understood as scientific reform. And among those scientific reforms was the introduction of eugenics.
Yeah. The other point I wanted to make is that over the horizon, all these things we're talking about are very much a part of the Western world, and I think perhaps even particularly the Anglosphere. And over the horizon, you have a major rising technological powers who don't have these kinds of issues that we have. So that's also going to be a growing factor over the next decade or two.
You think the Chinese? Well, I think it's obvious the Chinese would be much more interested in these things. If you look at something like the Beijing Genomics Project, is that what it's called, the Genomics Institute or something like that?
BGI, yes.
Yeah, and they are actually looking very intently on the idea of what makes heritable genius, hereditary genius. They're very concerned with this.
They're doing a huge GWAS, a genome-wide association study, and although GWASs have kind of got a not very stellar reputation, as one of the BGI people pointed out, that's because they've never had a big enough sample to work from, and you get better you're going to get better results as the sample size increases. A very good place to read about this is Steve Hsu's blog. That's his last name is HSU, Hsu. He's a Chinese American, and he's involved in the BGI project, and he blogs very intelligently about it at, I think it's called InfoProc. But if you Google Steve Hsu, you'll find it. So yeah, that's happening, and we're going to know much more in the near future, and it's just going to get harder to deny these things.
Yeah, maybe one could say that as America begins to decline as a world power, this let's say 20th century Americanist ideology of we're all created equal, so on and so forth. America should, be all, the whole world should be democratic, and so on and so forth. That maybe as that begins to wane as well, there'll be new openings for the dissident right, and we'll be able to take on new forms and find new allies and.
But it seems that all of Eastern Europe.
Oh yeah.
It stands outside of this global democratic orbit. I mean, a country like Hungary under Orban has an extremely right-wing government.
Yeah.
The Slovaks have these neo-fascists who are, part of their governing coalition. Just about every Eastern European country, every country that was under the former Soviet bloc, is politically well to the right of the United States and Western Europe, which form a kind of, Anglo-Western European liberal democratic bloc. And of course, Russia itself has been, I think, perhaps minimally affected by the ideas that we've been deploring.
Yeah, I mean, the Soviet Union, ironically, formed a kind of barrier against cultural Marxism.
That's right. They're good Marxists.
Yeah. Well, anyway, gentlemen, why don't we put a bookmark in this discussion? But I would love to take it up again, because there's a lot more that we should actually talk about. But anyway, I really enjoyed this, and I'm sure our listeners will too. So I'd like to thank you both for being on the program.
Well, thanks for having me on, Richard. It was fun.
And thanks for having me on from rural Pennsylvania. Paul Gottfried.
So we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay.
All right, bye.
Bye.